Orphaned Cashier gave her lunch to a homeless man, never suspecting he was her missing uncle. Wasn't just a random act of kindness that changed two lives forever, it was the moment Ellie Parker's fragmented world began piecing itself back together. The January wind cut through her thin uniform jacket as Ellie hurried toward the sliding doors of Value Mart, her shoulders hunched against the cold. 23 years old, with tired eyes that belonged to someone much older, she pulled her name tag from her bag and pinned it to her chest. Employee of the Month, 3 months running, an achievement that felt hollow when you had no one to share it with. 6 a.m. Shifts were brutal, but Ellie preferred them. Fewer customers meant fewer forced smiles, fewer polite inquiries about her day that she had to navigate with rehearsed responses. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she settled behind Register 3, her designated spot for the past 4 years. 4 years of scanning groceries, counting change, and watching families shop together, something she hadn't experienced since she was 8. Morning, sunshine. Marcus, the store manager, placed a steaming cup of coffee on her counter. His kindness was consistent, if somewhat paternal, for someone only 10 years her senior. Thanks. Ellie wrapped her fingers around the warmth, the sensation a small comfort in her routine. You bringing lunch today? He asked, the same question he posed 3 times a week, knowing she often forgot to eat. Ellie nodded. Made a sandwich last night. The truth was she'd carefully budgeted for that sandwich, turkey with the last slice of cheese from her refrigerator, and an apple that was just this side of too soft. Every dollar mattered when rent took most of your paycheck. The morning passed in a blur of barcode beeps and mumbled, "Have a nice days." By noon, the dull ache of hunger pulled at her stomach. She reached for her lunch in the small break room refrigerator, wrapped in a paper bag with Ellie, written in her precise handwriting. A habit from foster care, label everything or risk losing it. Lunch break meant 15 minutes of solitude on the bench outside the store's side entrance. It wasn't scenic, just a view of the parking lot and a small patch of struggling grass, but it was hers. As Ellie unwrapped her sandwich, she noticed him. He hadn't been there yesterday. A man with weathered skin and a gray-streaked beard sat huddled against the building's brick wall, about 20 feet away. His clothes were layered and worn, a cardboard sign propped beside him that Ellie couldn't read from this distance. Something about the way he held himself, dignity intact despite circumstances, made her pause mid-bite. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, his gaze dropping to the concrete as though ashamed to be caught looking. In that fleeting moment, something inexplicably familiar flickered across his features, a ghost of recognition that made no sense to Ellie. She wasn't naive about homelessness. The city had its share, and Value Mart's managers routinely asked them to move along. But something about this man, perhaps the slight tremor in his hands or the hollow of his cheeks, pierced through Ellie's carefully constructed wall of self-preservation. Before she could reconsider, Ellie wrapped her sandwich back in its paper and walked toward him. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step. She wasn't good with strangers. Years in the foster system had taught her caution, not connection. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than intended. "Would you like this?" "I'm not hungry." The lie was transparent, contradicted by the growl of her stomach, but she held the sandwich out anyway. The man looked up, his eyes a startling blue against his weathered face. Those eyes, a disorienting sense of déjà vu washed over her. Had she seen him before? "You sure?" His voice was rough but gentle, carrying an accent she couldn't place. Ellie nodded, unable to articulate the compulsion driving her actions. His calloused hands accepted the offering with surprising grace. "Thank you, miss." "Been a while since?" He trailed off, staring at the sandwich as though it might disappear. "I'm Ellie," she said, then immediately wondered why she'd offered her name. The man's hands stilled, a barely perceptible shift in his posture, a tightening around his eyes. "James," he replied after a pause that lasted a beat too long. "My name's James." Ellie nodded awkwardly and retreated to her bench, suddenly self-conscious. The apple would have to sustain her for the remaining 6 hours of her shift. As she bit into it, she watched James from the corner of her eye. He ate slowly, methodically, as though savoring each bite. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper wrapper and tucked it into his pocket rather than discarding it. Marcus caught her arm when she returned inside. "Was that your lunch you gave away?" His tone wasn't accusatory, merely concerned. "It's fine," Ellie said. "I wasn't that hungry." "Your heart's too big for your own good, kid." He pressed a $5 bill into her hand. "Get something from the deli." That's an order. Ellie started to protest but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. Thanks, Marcus. Throughout her afternoon shift, Ellie found herself glancing toward the exit, wondering if James was still there. She couldn't understand why his face seemed to tug at some buried memory. Perhaps he reminded her of someone from one of her many foster homes. Faces blurred together after a while, years of temporary families creating a collage of half-remembered connections. By closing time, the temperature had dropped further, and rain threatened in the heavy clouds. Ellie pulled her jacket tighter as she exited through the employee door. To her surprise, James was still there, huddled beneath the building's small overhang, fighting the occasional drop. The words caught in her throat. What was she doing? Do you have somewhere to go tonight? It's going to rain. James looked up, surprise evident in his expression. Don't you worry about me. Been managing just fine. But the slight shiver that ran through his frame told a different story. There's a shelter on 8th Street, Ellie said. About 10 blocks from here. They're full up most nights, James replied, revealing his familiarity with the system. And they don't take kindly to latecomers. Ellie bit her lip, a battle waging inside her. The sensible part, the part that had kept her safe, if lonely, screamed caution. But something else, something she thought had been extinguished years ago when her last hope of adoption fell through, whispered, connection. The words hung in the damp air between them. I could buy you dinner. There's a diner across the street that's cheap. James stared at her, confusion creasing his brow. Why would you do that? It was a fair question, one Ellie couldn't properly answer. Same reason I gave you my sandwich, I guess. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a vinyl booth at Mel's Diner, steam rising from 2 cups of coffee. Ellie had ordered them each the budget special, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and canned green beans. The waitress had eyed James suspiciously until Ellie firmly stated they were together. So, you work at Value Mart long? James asked, his voice tentative, as though unaccustomed to conversation. 4 years. Ellie stirred her coffee, watching the cream create swirling patterns. It's not exciting, but it pays the rent. Mostly? James nodded, his eyes occasionally darting to her face before quickly looking away. You from around here originally? The question was innocent enough, but Ellie's guard instinctively rose. Her past wasn't something she discussed, not even with co-workers she'd known for years. Sort of, she offered vaguely. Been here since I was a kid. James seemed to sense her hesitation and changed course. That manager of yours seems decent. Watched him bring you coffee this morning. Ellie's eyebrows raised. You were watching the store that early? A flush crept up James's neck. Not watching exactly, just observing. When you don't have anywhere particular to be, you notice things. Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. Ellie watched as James carefully arranged his napkin on his lap, a gesture too refined for someone who'd spent years on the streets. The incongruity piqued her curiosity. Have you been... She searched for a delicate way to phrase it. Has it been long? Being homeless, I mean. James cut his meatloaf with precise movements. On and off for about 10 years. Had an apartment for a while 3 years back, but lost the job that was keeping it. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Wasn't always like this. What did you do before? Ellie found herself genuinely interested, the usual wall she maintained with strangers slowly lowering. A shadow passed over James's features. Construction mostly. Good with my hands. He flexed his fingers as if to demonstrate, and Ellie noticed a faded scar running across his palm. Had a family once too. The wistfulness in his voice resonated with something deep inside Ellie. She recognized the tone, had heard it in her own voice during rare moments of vulnerability. What happened to them? She asked softly. James set down his fork, his appetite seemingly diminished. Lost them. Some by choice, some by circumstance. His eyes, when they finally met hers fully, held such profound sadness that Ellie had to look away. Made mistakes I couldn't fix. They ate in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken histories filling the space between them. Outside, the rain had started in earnest, drumming against the diner's windows. I should get going, Ellie said eventually, calculating the tip she could afford to leave. Early shift tomorrow. Thank you, James said, the words heavy with sincerity. Not just for the food, for sitting with me, for talking. Been a while since anyone looked me in the eye. Something twisted in Ellie's chest, recognition of a loneliness that mirrored her own. On impulse, she pulled a Value Mart receipt from her wallet and scribbled on the back. Here's my number, she said, sliding it across the table. If you need anything, or just to talk. She immediately felt foolish. He probably didn't have a phone. To her surprise, James pulled an ancient flip phone from his pocket. Battery only lasts about a day, and I have to be careful with minutes, but I keep it charged when I can. For emergencies. Ellie nodded, oddly relieved. Well, use it if you need to. She stood, leaving money on the table for their meal. Good night, James. Good night, Ellie, he replied, and something in the way he said her name, gentle, almost reverent, sent a shiver down her spine. She walked the 4 blocks to her apartment in the rain, her mind replaying their conversation. Why had she given her number to a homeless stranger? What was it about his eyes that seemed to reach into her past? By the time she unlocked her door, she'd convinced herself he would never call. 3 days passed, and Ellie found herself looking for James each time she arrived at work. He wasn't at his spot by the wall, and she tried to ignore the disappointment that settled in her stomach. On the 4th day, during her lunch break, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Ellie? It's James. His voice sounded strained. I wouldn't bother you, but I remembered you mentioned having first aid supplies. Got a bad cut on my hand, and the clinic's not open till tomorrow. 30 minutes later, Ellie was cleaning a nasty gash on James's palm with supplies from the Value Mart first aid kit. They sat on her usual bench, his hand resting on a clean napkin across her lap. How did this happen? She asked, applying antiseptic that made him wince. Dumpster diving, he admitted. Someone threw away a broken picture frame. Glass got me. As Ellie wrapped gauze around his palm, she noticed a small tattoo on his wrist, mostly faded with age. 3 tiny stars in a constellation pattern. That's Cassiopeia, she said automatically, then felt self-conscious about recognizing it. James stared at her, something like wonder crossing his face. You know constellations? Ellie shrugged, securing the bandage. Used to have a book about them. When I was little, my brother was an amateur astronomer, James said quietly. Used to take his daughter stargazing. He gave me this tattoo design, said even when we were apart we'd be looking at the same stars. The intimate detail hung in the air between them. Ellie found herself wanting to know more but hesitant to pry. You're close with your brother? Pain flashed across James's features. Was. He died. Car accident 15 years ago. His voice grew distant. Him and his wife both. Left behind their little girl. Ellie's hands stilled on the bandage. 15 years ago. A car accident, a little girl. The coincidence made her heart rate quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. Thousands of people died in car accidents every year. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it. About your brother? James nodded, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. The worst part wasn't losing him. It was losing her, my niece. His voice broke slightly. I tried to keep her. Fought for custody. But I had issues back then. Drinking, mainly. Courts decided I wasn't fit. Last I heard, she went into the system. By the time I got myself straightened out, I couldn't find her. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The familiar ache of abandonment, one she'd carried since childhood, flared sharply. She'd spent years imagining scenarios just like this, a relative searching for her, wanting her, missing her. Reality had been far crueler. Maybe she's still out there, Ellie offered, surprised by her own optimism. James's smile was sad. Maybe. She'd be grown now. 23 this past October. Ellie dropped the bandage scissors. October was her birth month. She was 23, but it couldn't be. The universe wasn't that convenient, that kind. Ellie? You okay? James's concerned voice pulled her back. Fine, she managed, gathering the first aid supplies with trembling hands. Just remembered I promised to cover someone's shift tomorrow. It was a transparent lie, but James didn't challenge it. He flexed his bandaged hand. Thanks for this. Don't know many people who'd help a stranger twice in 1 week. It's nothing, Ellie said, her mind racing with impossible connections. I should get back inside. That night, sleep eluded Ellie. She stared at her ceiling, mentally cataloging what little she knew about her past. Parents died when she was 8. Car accident. No relatives able to take her. Shuffled through 7 foster homes until aging out of the system at 18. She'd stopped asking questions years ago after a particularly painful rejection from a foster family who'd initially talked about adoption. What was the point of knowing details about people who were gone forever? But now a wild possibility had taken root. The timing matched. The circumstances matched. And those eyes, that familiar blue that had triggered such déjà vu, could they be a family resemblance she'd forgotten? In the morning, exhausted but determined, Ellie called in sick for the first time in 2 years. Instead of going to Value Mart, she took a bus across town to the Department of Children's Services, where her case had been handled. The same gray building, with its institutional smell and flickering fluorescent lights, brought back a flood of uncomfortable memories. "I need information about my case," she told the receptionist. "From 15 years ago." 3 hours later, after multiple forms, ID verifications, and explanations, Ellie sat across from a social worker named Diane, who had retrieved a dusty file from the archives. "There's not much here that you wouldn't already know," Diane said, flipping through pages. "Your parents, Robert and Claire Parker, died in a highway collision on October 12th, 15 years ago. You were placed in emergency foster care while relative placements were evaluated." Ellie leaned forward. "Were there any relatives who wanted custody? Anyone who tried?" Diane skimmed a page, then nodded. "There was one, your father's brother, James Parker. He filed for custody but was denied due to—" She hesitated. "Due to what?" Ellie pressed. "Substance abuse issues and unstable housing." Diane looked up sympathetically. "He appealed twice but was ultimately deemed unsuitable. After that, there's no further mention of him in your file. James Parker." The name blazed in Ellie's mind like a neon sign. James, like the homeless man she'd been feeding. Parker, her own last name, which she'd never mentioned to him. "Do you have a photo?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible. "Of James Parker?" Diane shook her head. "Not in this file. There might be one in the court records, but those would require a different request form. It could take weeks." Ellie couldn't wait weeks. The possibility that she'd unknowingly encountered her long-lost uncle, her only living relative, was too overwhelming to ignore. "Is there anything else you can tell me about him? Anything distinctive?" Diane frowned, scanning the notes. "Not much. There's a mention of a tattoo noted during one of his court appearances. Something about stars on his wrist." Ellie's heart thundered in her chest. "Cassiopeia, 3 tiny stars." She thanked Diane, declined the offer to make copies of her file, and hurried out into the spring sunshine. Her mind raced with questions. If James, her James, the homeless man, was truly her uncle, why hadn't he said anything? Had he recognized her? Or was this all an impossible coincidence? For the next 2 days, Ellie searched. She checked his usual spot near Value Mart, asked at the shelter on 8th Street, even returned to Mel's Diner to see if anyone had seen him. Nothing. Her phone calls went straight to voicemail, his prepaid minutes likely expired. On the 3rd day, as rain pounded the city once again, Ellie expanded her search to the abandoned warehouse district where many of the city's homeless took shelter during bad weather. Desperation drove her through puddles and down alleyways, her jacket soaked through, calling his name. She found him in the doorway of an old textile factory, huddled beneath a tattered tarp, his possessions gathered close. He looked up at her approach, shock registering on his face. "Ellie? What are you doing here?" "You're soaked." She stood before him, rain streaming down her face, mingling with tears she couldn't contain. "Is your last name Parker?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. James stared at her, the color draining from his face. "How did you—" "Your brother was Robert Parker," Ellie continued, her voice breaking. "He died 15 years ago with his wife Claire, in a car accident. They had a daughter named Elizabeth, but everyone called her Ellie." James rose slowly to his feet, disbelief etched in every line of his weathered face. "It can't be," he whispered. "My Ellie had a birthmark, a small heart shape behind her right ear." With trembling fingers, Ellie pushed back her wet hair and turned, revealing the tiny heart-shaped mark she'd had since birth. A mark so easy to miss unless you were looking for it. A mark only family would know about. James's legs seemed to give way. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, his breathing ragged. "All this time?" he murmured. "All this time, and you were right in front of me. Why didn't you say something?" Ellie asked, tears flowing freely now. "When I told you my name?" "Ellie is a common name," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And the chances that my niece would be here in this city, working at that store, it seemed impossible. I convinced myself I was seeing what I wanted to see." "When did you know?" she pressed. "When did you suspect?" "The constellations," he admitted. "When you recognized Cassiopeia? Your father used to read you that book every night. And then your age, your birth month? But I couldn't believe it. Couldn't let myself hope." The rain continued to fall around them, but neither moved. 15 years of separation, of loss, of wondering, all collapsing into this singular moment of recognition. "I tried to find you." James said, his voice breaking. For years. Got sober, got a job, saved money for a lawyer. But the records were sealed, and by then, you'd been moved so many times. They told me no one wanted me, Ellie whispered, the pain of that belief, carried for so long, finally finding voice. That there was no family left? No. James shook his head fiercely. No, Ellie. I fought for you. I never stopped looking. Never stopped hoping. And then, after 15 years of absence, James Parker opened his arms to his niece. Ellie stepped forward, into an embrace that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The warmth of family, something she'd convinced herself she would never experience again, enveloped her as surely as the rain that soaked them both. Later, in Ellie's small apartment, they sat across from each other at her kitchen table, steaming mugs of tea between them. James wore borrowed clothes, sweatpants and a t-shirt that hung loosely on his thin frame. The enormity of their discovery had given way to tentative questions, to filling in the vast gap of years lost. I have something, James said, reaching for the plastic bag that contained his few possessions. From inside a water-resistant pouch, he pulled a tattered photograph. I've carried this everywhere. He handed it to Ellie. The image showed a younger James, alongside a man who looked strikingly similar, her father. Between them stood a little girl with missing front teeth and pigtails, beaming at the camera. Ellie recognized herself instantly, though the memory of that day had long faded. That was at the lake house, James explained. The summer before the accident. Your dad and I used to take you fishing. Ellie traced the outline of her father's face with a trembling finger. I don't remember much about them anymore. Just fragments. Your mother made the best apple pie in 3 counties, James offered, a small smile playing at his lips. And your father couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he sang constantly. Drove everyone crazy. Each detail was a precious gift, filling holes in Ellie's heart she'd stopped acknowledging years ago. Tell me more, she whispered. Tell me everything you remember. So James did. Through the night, over tea that grew cold and was refreshed, he shared stories of the brother he'd lost and the family they'd been. He spoke of Ellie's first steps, her fascination with butterflies, the way she'd insist on wearing mismatched socks because they get lonely without their friends. In return, Ellie hesitantly shared fragments of her life after, the series of foster homes, some kind, some merely adequate, none permanent. The way she'd stopped unpacking her suitcase after the 3rd placement, living out of bags until she was 18 and found this apartment. Her job at Value Mart, chosen because they didn't require college degrees she couldn't afford to pursue. I failed you, James said, his eyes filled with regret. I should have fought harder, stayed sober sooner. No, Ellie reached across the table, taking his scarred hand in hers. You're here now. That's what matters. The following weeks brought rapid change. With Ellie's help, James secured a bed at a transitional housing program for veterans, another detail of his life she was still learning, 4 years in the Army before her father died. He attended job readiness training during the day, while Ellie worked her shifts at Value Mart. Their evenings were spent together, rebuilding a relationship that had been severed for 15 years. It wasn't always easy. James struggled with the shame of his past, the years lost to addiction and homelessness. Ellie grappled with trust issues born from repeated abandonment. There were awkward silences, misunderstandings, moments when the weight of their separate traumas seemed too heavy to bridge. But there were beautiful moments, too. The day James secured a part-time maintenance position at a local community center. The evening Ellie discovered her uncle could still make the paper boats he'd taught her to fold as a child. The Sunday morning, they visited her parents' graves together, placing wildflowers on the long-neglected stones. 3 months after their rain-soaked reunion, Ellie used her employee discount to buy a small cake from the Value Mart bakery. She set it on her kitchen table, where James now regularly joined her for dinner, his transitional housing just a short bus ride away. What's the occasion? He asked, eyeing the chocolate frosting with appreciation. I got accepted, Ellie said, unable to contain her smile. To community college, starting this fall. James's face lit up with pride. That's wonderful. What will you study? Astronomy, Ellie replied, her choice surprising even herself when she'd filled out the application. I want to learn about the stars. All of them, not just Cassiopeia. James's eyes glistened. Your father would be so proud. Both of them would. They ate cake and talked of the future, a concept that had once seemed pointless to Ellie and out of reach to James. They made plans for a small Thanksgiving dinner, their first holiday together since she was 8 years old. They dreamed aloud about saving for a trip to the lake house, now owned by someone else but still standing, according to James's research. Later that evening, as they stood on Ellie's small balcony looking at the night sky, James pointed upward. There she is, Cassiopeia. Ellie followed his finger to the distinctive W-shaped constellation, the queen who boasted of her beauty, she remembered from her childhood book, and was placed among the stars forever, James finished. He glanced at Ellie, his face softened by moonlight. Your dad used to say we're all made of stardust. That even when people leave us, they're still part of the same universe, still connected. Ellie leaned her head against her uncle's shoulder, feeling the solid presence of family, something she'd convinced herself was lost forever. He was right. Above them, Cassiopeia gleamed in the velvet sky, unchanging despite the 15 years that had passed since they'd last viewed it together. Just as the bond between them, though stretched thin by time and circumstance, had never truly broken. Thank you, James said softly. For what? For that sandwich. For seeing me when I was invisible. For being the kind of person who helped strangers. His voice caught. Your parents did that part right, even if I wasn't there to see it. Ellie smiled through the tears that threatened. Maybe it runs in the family. In her tiny apartment with the stars watching from above, Ellie Parker rediscovered what family meant. Not just shared DNA or similar features, but a connection that transcended time, distance, and hardship. A bond that, once recognized, could begin to heal wounds too long left open. And it had all started with a sandwich, a simple act of kindness from an orphaned cashier to a homeless man, neither suspecting they were reaching across 15 years of separation to find the only family they had left in the world.